Namaskar, welcome back to Media Scan. Viewers, we are slowly reaching the last two phases of the electoral process of the largest election on this planet. For the last several months and on several occasions on Media Scan, we have been noticing how the Western media has been writing continuously, commenting, analyzing about what it says a threat to Indian democracy, the Indian electoral system, free speech, etc. These articles, commentaries, analysis often focus on the fact that democracy is not as vibrant as it used to be in our country, and some of them have gone so far as to say that if the present regime comes back to power, Indian democracy will be at a threat, Indian elections will be at a threat. Today, we have a special guest on Media Scan who is not an Indian, but like many of us, he wanted to see whether what is being written in the Western media is really reflecting on the ground, or is it not reflective of the real picture. And he decided to travel to India, look at the elections firsthand. So, what were his opinions? What has he concluded from his visit to India, and would he subscribe to the majority of the opinion that is being published is what we are going to discuss on Media Scan this evening. Allow me to welcome Sam Stevenson, Assistant Editor in the Daily Express of London. Sam is just back from India after a hectic tour of some of the most interesting electoral places as well as cultural sites of the country. What were his impressions? What are his conclusions? And what has he actually taken back from his visit to the country is something we'll be going through in this episode. Sam, welcome to Media Scan. Namaskar.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today to share some of my experiences of reporting from the ground of this vibrant democracy.
Fine. So, let's begin. The first question is very simple. What were your first impressions when you landed in India and you started observing the elections and our politics firsthand?
Look, my first impressions were quite simple. This is quite literally a festival of democracy. It's a carnival atmosphere on the streets. And this is like nothing I've ever witnessed before in my life, especially in the UK. There is an enthusiasm for democracy in India, like nothing that you will witness in Europe or in other parts of the West. People are really engaging with democracy here in a way that I have not seen in London. And maybe this is because in London people take democracy for granted, which is something that doesn't seem to be the case in India. People are prepared to brave 45-degree heat to come out and vote. And we witnessed that on the ground in Uttar Pradesh on polling day when we visited the ancient Sri Ayodhya, home to the Ram temple, of course. And people were out on the ground. It was 45 degrees Celsius and people were prepared to vote. It was not putting people off. People are incredibly engaged with democracy here in India. That was my first impression.
But
yes, and the vibrancy of it.
Yes, I also want to know from you, there is, you talked about the, elections being like a festival, a carnival in our country. And certainly there is a lot of color and, lot of street color during our elections, even on voting day. But there is a certain opinion which often says that in India, there's a lot of, outdoor activity during elections and we see a lot of color. But it is still, there are still, things lacking in the actual, when you look at the pillars of democracy. Did you get such an impression?
Well, not particularly, because as I say, we were also lucky enough to travel to rural Punjab, where we attended a BJP campaign rally in a rural area just outside the main city of Amritsar. And actually there, what we witnessed were communist protesters on the ground who are, of course, anti-BJP, and they were screaming chants such as down with the BJP, down with Modi. So actually, I believe the opposite is true on the ground, that we are seeing people of all opinions able to express their views loudly and clearly. No one was trying to shut these people down. They were able to chant their slogans using a very loud PA system, and it was almost drowning out the candidate, Ambassador Sandhu. So actually, I believe the opposite is true of democracy being under threat, because I've witnessed opposition elements coming to the fore and protesting in a lively and vibrant way.
Yes, loud protests are quite an essential part of our politics all the time. But very interesting that you pointed it out. Also, you know, since you mentioned this incident or that you came across in your travels to Punjab, I just wanted to know, you were saying, you know, Indian elections are nothing like what you witnessed in other countries, particularly in UK, which is your home country. So what would you say was unique about our elections, you know, from an observer's point of view?
Well, not least the sheer scale of the event itself. I mean, the actual idea of having to get these physical polling booths within a certain distance of each registered voter. So that can require having to physically travel with these polling booths across jungles, across rivers, across mountainous areas, because there are many people living in very rural areas in India. So it's actually the physical scale of the challenge of delivering democracy to this many, almost 1 billion voters. But also the key difference that I would note is the sense of apathy that we have in the UK. So as you will be aware, an election has recently been called within the last couple of days in London. And actually, the reaction of a lot of people on the streets who have been vox popped for media broadcasters here in Britain has been to say, oh, I don't know who to vote for, they're all as bad as each other. And people don't feel very engaged with politics. We really struggle with voter turnout, and people don't actually feel as though voting will make any difference. And a key difference here is deliverance, okay? So the BJP has actually delivered on its manifesto commitments, whereas the Conservative Party in Britain have been promising for the last 4 or 5 elections that they're going to get net migration down. However, the absolute opposite has happened. So what we're seeing is deliverance of policies. And actually, I think that's why people are more engaged with politics in India, because they can see a tangible difference. Yeah? Whereas in the UK,
yes,
we're not seeing that.
I'll come to some of those elements. Perhaps, I mean, could we say that there is a certain cynicism developing in the West, in countries like the UK, towards their governments as well as the entire democratic, process?
100%. I actually think that in many ways, democracy is more under threat in the West because of this. I think voter apathy is one of the greatest threats to democracy that exists. And I don't think you can say the same for India. There's no voter apathy here. Ultimately, you've got a very, very effective, very, very well organized campaign machine in the BJP. And that is why they're winning. They're good politicians at the end of the day, and people in the West don't like the fact that they're winning, perhaps because of their own political alignments. But actually, when you look back to the Gandhi dynasty, you had what was effectively a political monarchy for years. But no one was complaining then. So I think that's an interesting point. I think that the BJP is doing very well because it's a politically well-oiled machine. And again, this is something that I've personally witnessed. I went to some of the BJP campaign headquarters when I was in Amritsar, and I witnessed the social media cell, and we took photos, and they were extremely well organised, and their campaign is very effective. And if that means,
true. Our political parties, including the BJP, have really sort of made it big on the social media platforms, you know. It has become an essential part of their campaign. A lot of their campaign highlights are now visible more on social media, but then we have to change with the changing times. But since, Sam, since you were talking about, democracy perhaps being more under threat in the West than anywhere else, there are a couple of headlines I would like to read out to you. This says, will India's election be free and fair? Another one says, India's elections this year stand out for their undemocratic nature. Another one, as India goes to the polls, can democracy deliver a better life for its people? And there is a last one which says, I have dozens of them. One of them says, is today's India more unequal than under the British rule? Now, these are some of the most respected, some of the most reputed publications of the world. And these are headlines we have read in the past about a month or so, perhaps 5 or 6 weeks. How would you like to look at these headlines now that you've seen things for yourself?
Look, as I've said before, I can't speak for individual media organisations. I'm not here to do that. But I will say that, yes, I agree with you. These are some of the most well-respected publications in the UK and across the West. And they are saying this. So unfortunately, that then becomes the prevailing narrative. That then starts to set in and people begin to think that and the misconceptions start to creep in. But look, the reality that I've seen has not been that at all. And you may have seen me then just sort of laughing a little bit because I think it's actually laughable that Indians are not able to look after themselves. It's almost like these stories are sneering, if you like, at the Indian people. And I think that we need to bring in a little bit more respect for the Indian people. And we need to understand that, you know, they are running things on their own terms and they're doing a good job. And actually, I think it's about time that we recognise some of the successes that we're seeing coming out of India. For example, UPI payments, the UPI payment system, which I don't believe has even been embraced by the UK yet, but we're seeing that that's already being started to be rolled out in France, for example, for going onto the Eiffel Tower. But also things like infrastructure development. We can't even build a railway in the UK, so it's quite embarrassing. Look, I think for us to look down on the Indians and in this way, I don't think is right, and it's not something that I've seen borne out on the ground. Democracy doesn't seem to be under threat at all. I think that there's a tendency, as you alluded to earlier, to simplify the narrative and to put your own people's own spin on the narrative themselves without actually doing a bit of the work themselves. But also, perhaps these sorts of stories are getting the kind of reaction that these publications want, in the sense that they're being shared by people in frustration. And actually, as I said, a conversation I had with someone on Republic TV last Sunday, they essentially said that, you know, Indians are saddened by this. It's not so much anger; it's just sadness. It's a sad thing.
You know, Sam, it could have been a laughing matter had it not been such a serious issue, and particularly when there is a trend visible, you know, in dozens of publications at the same time. It does build up a narrative which is then carried forward by various think tanks and, you know, education campuses and etc. But just wanted to ask you, one very common strain that is visible in these stories is also about, you know, the current Indian government, you know, having a sort of a different design for the minorities of the country. And there are headlines I can see here. India's parliament has fewer Muslims as strength of Modi's party grows. Invisible in our own country, being Muslim in Modi's India is an opinion column. He likes scaring people is one headline talking of Home Minister Amit Shah. Then there is there are other headlines talking about a divisive campaign, divisive rhetoric being run by the ruling party. You did watch the campaign for yourself. You also observed the voting, but more particularly, you know, the how the campaign is going on in the country at present. Do you think this is a fair reflection of what is going on in our country, or you think it is a unidimensional way of projecting it?
No, look, this is a serious matter, and yes, as I say, on the ground, I could list you some other headlines as well, by the way, which I won't necessarily do, but that also portray that same narrative. What we thought we'd do is we thought we'd visit the Ram Temple on polling day, because that is where a lot of these narratives have come out of the Ram Temple. And actually, on the ground in Ayodhya, we came across plenty of Muslim women who were actually unaccompanied, which is in itself relatively rare. And they were actually happy to be photographed, and they were actually coming up to us, coming up to our photographer and asking to be photographed for our newspaper, which he assures me, he's a veteran photojournalist and he's been all over the world, all over the Middle East and lots of different countries. He assures me that is a particularly rare thing to see, that Muslim women will feel safe enough to come up and have their pictures taken by Western media. So on the ground, we are seeing, there's a mosque within 500 meters of the Ram temple. We actually spoke to Muslims on the ground, and I wrote about this. And they said to me that they were happy that the Hindus had their Ram temple restored because it gave them something that they have long yearned for. So again, this narrative, I think it's being oversimplified because Modi has made one comment in a speech, which was actually referring to illegal immigration from Bangladesh and Myanmar. And these people just so happen to be Muslims. The reason he uses this language is because he's trying to communicate with what you might describe as the lowest common denominator in the audience. So he has to use language of the common tongue so that people can engage with what he's saying. He is, after all, a politician, and a successful politician at that. So I think we have to understand that, yes, there's certain rhetoric, but you need to probe beneath the surface a little bit, and there's a tendency to sort of oversimplify it as, oh, all Muslims are under attack, when really he's referring to specific illegal immigrants, or in other cases, criminals. And we were lucky enough to meet with Shri Iqbal Singh Laupora, who is the chairman of the National Commission for Minorities in India, who informed us that over the last 3 years in his tenure, there had been less than 100 official cases of discrimination across the entire nation. Now, we're talking a nation of 1.4 billion people. So for there only to have been less than 100 official cases come across his desk, I think that fact really speaks to the pluralist nature of India, and the fact that discrimination against minorities is not necessarily as prevalent as perhaps you would be led to believe.
So Sam, just to add, illegal immigration from our neighboring countries, and it is mostly people of one particular religion, remains one of our biggest challenges in the country. And even the apex court of the country, Supreme Court, has expressed not once but more than once its concern for this big population of infiltrators who are becoming a drain on our resources. But that's a discussion for another day perhaps. Right now, since you pointed out how you interacted with Muslim women and other people, and how they shared their thoughts with you, there is, I want to come to a larger question, Sam. You talked about oversimplification in many of these headlines and the way stories are being filed. Our curiosity always remains, and this is an old question in my mind, and that is, why do you think so many of these stories get it wrong? And it has been proved that they were wrong on earlier occasions in previous elections. The question remains, do you think it is because, for a foreigner, for a foreign national, it is just too complicated to understand our society, our complexities, and the diversity in our country? Or do you think it is a deliberate unidimensional effort to create a certain impression against a party or against a certain political ideology?
It's difficult to say. I think that people have a tendency to view India through a certain lens, and they're a bit blinkered when they come here. And I think that's the problem, really. You have to sort of look past some of look, clearly, when you come to India, it's a very different looking place, a very different feeling place. It's very hot. It's very, it's very busy. It's loud. People, it's very chaotic in some ways, but it's organized chaos, you see. And this is something that I found, people are driving on the roads in what I might describe as a quite disorderly way, but there is order to it, and people follow a certain rule. This is the land of hope and freedom. People are driving in a way that they feel is correct. But I think the problem is people come here and expect it to fit into the same box as the West, when really it's doing things its own way, and it's pluralist. And
I'll ask you a direct question. Yeah. Is there an attempt to create fear-mongering about India?
I don't know if it's a deliberate attempt, and I don't know if it's being done, as you say, deliberately, but that's certainly what's the impact of what's happening, I believe, yes. In some ways.
If it is not deliberate, do you think it is a lack of understanding, a lack of in-depth analysis?
I think it's just an unwillingness to view India through the lens of progress and the lens of, because look, these changes are happening in the last sort of 5 and 10 years. So that's pretty rapid change that we're seeing. So people just need to understand that we can't always view India through the old lens. This is a new India, and this is a new and progressing India. And I think that's what people need to just perhaps come in with a fresh set of eyes and remove all their preconceptions about India when they're reporting, like I've done.
So if it is a lack of perspective or understanding, what would you advise or suggest to your friends, in the Western media? What do you think they should do to get, to read India right?
Well, I would gently encourage my colleagues to join me as I've done on the ground and just report what we see. Just speak to people and just show off this nation for what it is, and actually try and find some of the positive elements that are happening here, and not just focus on. There's a tendency to come and say, I mean, you might call it poverty porn, for example, just focusing on the poverty. But actually, there's another story to be told in the trajectory of India and the growth of India, and the fact that people are being lifted into prosperity now as a result of sweeping welfare reforms. Houses are being built on an incredible scale. We've got infrastructure projects being rolled out at a rate of knots. These are things that in the West we're unable to do, and in Britain we certainly are unable to do. So I think it's just a question of coming in with a fresh set of eyes and actually removing some of those prejudices that may exist.
You think, not able to, not able to see clearly, or not able to project or highlight the growth and the infrastructure development and the progress that our country has made in their stories and opinions, is because, poverty porn still remains more glamorous than the development shown in the country?
I think so. I think, yes. I think ultimately, as I spoke to Shashi Shekhar about this, ultimately news outlets respond to the analytics. And if they're getting more clicks for the negative stuff, then they're going to keep doing the negative stuff. And that's sadly how it works. So there's a lot of that at play as well in terms of the business model of these outlets.
Sam, a very quick question. Here in India, among journalists, among commentators and academics, etc., there is a lot of growing concern about what shape democracy is taking in countries in the West also. When we see pictures of a terrible clampdown on protesters and people coming out on the streets in huge numbers, it has become a common refrain among commentators that when you look at London or New York or other cities in the UK and even other European cities, they somehow look very different. So perhaps, it is also time to look within. Or do you think that's an uncharitable comment?
I don't think it's uncharitable at all. As I said, I do believe that actually there are great threats to our democracy, not least apathy. Voter apathy has long been a great threat to the British democracy here and also in the US. People don't feel as though their vote means anything, but also polarization. We have a very, very wide polarization. People get very entrenched in their viewpoints, and they're not willing to engage in proper debate, and that can also be a problem as well. But yeah, no, I do think that we should look within ourselves before we start to criticize other nations, definitely, especially when India is a partner that we should be looking to going forwards, because this is a developing, growing and exciting place, and there's lots that we can do. But if we continue to put India down, then we're going to struggle to forge those all-important ties, because ultimately we've got shared values, shared culture, shared language, shared history, shared heritage, and we can have a shared future as well. But that's in our hands.
Sam, as a journalist, as an observer, but also as a foreign national, what would you say can one take back from India, when one visits a country like ours?
I think the warmth, not only physically but metaphorically, of the place, and that's to do with the people. So one thing that really struck me was the Indian hospitality. So how kind people are and how willing people are to welcome you not only into their homes but also into their places of worship, and also these sorts of really personal places. For example, at the Gurdwara in Delhi, when I went, a Sikh gentleman approached me and said, "Thank you so much for coming here. You are most welcome." And actually, I thought that was really special. And, he didn't need to come up and say that to me, but he did. And people were just very, very happy to see us in all these lovely places. Whereas, perhaps if you came to London as an Indian tourist, you would not get the same welcome, put it like that.
Right. So I'm afraid, Sam, there were a lot of other things I would have liked to chat with you about, but I'm afraid I just have time enough for one last question. You told us, very generously about what your colleagues in the West, in the Western media can do to read India better. I was just wanting, what do you think India and Indians, and particularly the Indian media, can do to make, the true picture of India get reflected positively in the West and the true picture to come out either way?
That's a difficult question, really. I think you've just got to keep doing what you're doing, and it's an incredibly pluralist nation and an incredibly pluralist broadcast ecology as well. So I don't really see how the Indians can really do much more, because everything's being reported on very openly. I think it's up to us to try and interpret it in a slightly different way, really, and it's up to us to try and show a bit more respect for the nation. I think that, I think maybe there's plenty of English, there's huge English language outlets here, so I don't really know how much more could be done off the top of my head, really, on that point.
Sam, I think, what you are doing is something that we all should be doing. That is, see things for yourself firsthand on the ground. Come and see what is, how fair are the thoughts that are being written. Do they really reflect the realities on the ground? And I guess nothing can be better than, more and increased engagement among peoples, among professionals, in order to have the best results. But I'm afraid that's all the time that we had on our show this evening. We will wait for your next visit here. Perhaps it should be longer than what it was this time, so that we have more friends like you coming here and trying to read India in the right way, not always in a generous or charitable way, but in an objective way. But on that note, I am afraid we shall have to end this conversation for this weekend. We will get back to you later once the elections are over. Thank you very much for connecting on Media Scan, Sam Stevenson. Democracy has always been a work in progress. But as Sam Stevenson pointed out, even for an outside observer, it is quite clear that democracy in India is alive and kicking. So is our electoral process. We are right now in the middle of the largest election on the planet, and the vibrance is visible to one and all. Will this trigger a thought among the opinion writers, the columnists and journalists who always like to paint a dismal picture of India's democracy, which is far removed from the truth? Think about that. We will connect again next weekend on Media Scan. Till then, namaskar.